I believe that there's a lot of Christians out there that are looking at the world today and saying, I should speak up, I should do something. I don't know what to do, but Lord, show me.
Gina Gleason is what you might call the tip of the spear when it comes to the national ballot collection effort among evangelical churches in California and across America.
And so we're here to actually help people, Christians, know what to do when they see these issues, because I feel a lot of people today are desiring to make a difference in the culture.
Gleason is the director of Real Impact, a ballot gathering ministry from Calvary Chapel, Chino Hills in Southern California, founded by Pastor Jack Hibbs. One of several efforts aimed at getting Christians to get out and vote, Real Impact collected nearly 20,000 ballots in the last 2 elections and works to help equip churches to, as they put it, stand for righteousness in the public square.
We have been involved in legal ballot collecting in California since it became legal. It was passed in 2016 by the Democrat legislature here in California. It was first implemented during the 2018 election cycle. And at that point, it seems that all the progressive candidates swept California. As a matter of fact, our own local Congresswoman, Young Kim, went off to Washington to new member orientation. And after those late ballots that had been collected were turned in, the count revealed that Young Kim was not the winner, and she was sent back home. So ballot collecting did make a big difference in 2018 here in California, from not only high-ranking congressional seats, but even down to our local school boards. So we realized that it was important for us to also be involved in ballot collecting. It was legal. And if we didn't, we would continue to lose at every election cycle.
Real Impact isn't alone. Other organizations like My Faith Votes also work to help churches and other ministries engage in ballot collection efforts. Jason Yates says while ballot collection efforts may be associated with left-leaning political movements, Christians can no longer afford to simply stay on the sidelines.
And there's a lot to be done to get people to participate in the process, to be poll workers, poll watchers, to just help in the process to ensure even the ballot gathering, providing secure places for ballots to be gathered, to introduce and ensure integrity in the process. But that could be one reason why people choose to stay home. I certainly hope not, because if they choose to stay home, then they're allowing the candidate that they oppose to win more than the one that they support.
So what exactly does it mean to engage in ballot collection? Also known as ballot harvesting, ballot collection, which is essentially the facilitation and collection of mail-in and absentee ballot voting, became what many believed at the time to be the safest way to vote during the COVID-19 pandemic and subsequent lockdowns.
During a public health crisis, people may want to avoid that kind of scene. So the obvious solution here is vote by mail. It's safe and it's easy.
Simply put, ballot harvesting describes the process in which a person who can be, but is not necessarily always, a paid political operative, collects absentee ballots en masse from voters and turns them in on their behalf. The term ballot harvesting carries a negative connotation for many conservatives, as it is often used to make the practice appear nefarious or outside legal bounds. But since several state election laws allow for such efforts, alternative terms like ballot gathering or ballot collecting are becoming popular alternatives amid attempts to get Christian conservatives more engaged in the effort. For Gleason, regardless of which label one might use for the practice, she says Christians need not be deterred by political name-calling.
The term that was first coined, ballot harvesting, was put out by the people that passed the law in the first place, ballot harvesting, and it just sounded so political. And I don't know, ballot collection just seemed as a more gentle way of being political, if you want to call it that.
Gleason says being bold, however, doesn't necessarily mean the church needs to change its approach in such a highly charged political climate.
Everyone wants to say that what we're doing is political. Well, I say that if we don't get involved in whatever term you want to use, we're just going to continue to be pushed out of the sphere of Christians having a say in how we're governed. So everything that I say and do with this ministry, I always encourage Christians and ministry leaders and other church leadership to always be winsome in the way you approach these difficult topics and what the world wants to call political. I stress that because they want to take anything that we say and do and tag us in a different way, that we're being worldly, when really what we're trying to do is take our biblical perspective, the principles that we get out of the Bible, and stand for them in the public square. I'm not going to allow them to dictate how we talk about these issues. They want to say ballot harvesting, let them say that. We're going to just call it whatever we decide we want to call it, and not always allow them to frame our actions in their terminologies.
Gleason has identified 17 states where churches can feasibly take an active role in ballot collecting. Those states are California, Delaware, Hawaii, Idaho, Illinois, Maryland, Nevada, New York, Oregon, Rhode Island, South Dakota, Tennessee, Utah, Vermont, Virginia, Washington, and Wyoming. She says it all begins with first understanding the law.
If you're going to do ballot collecting at my own church, we are going to train you as a volunteer. We'll make sure that you know what the law says. We'll make sure that we train you to handle the ballot safely, correctly, examining the ballot once the voter turns it into you, and how you handle it. And then from there, that initial handing over of the ballot to the volunteer, and the volunteer placing that ballot in a lock box.
From there, Gleason says, the ballots are placed in a locked and secure room overnight. The next day, volunteers begin separating the ballots and then deliver those ballots to county registrars for their respective counties.
We separate out the ballots and we deliver them to the county registrars for each of those different counties. And so there's procedures that we go through, not only from the handling of the ballot, but from things like alerting the congregation about our ballot collection efforts. And it has gone far beyond just our own church.
It's a process, she says, that all comes down to earning trust among the community.
We have people from all over Southern California driving their ballots to the church to hand them to us. Why? Well, because they trust us. They trust the members of this church to handle their ballots correctly. And so we have people from all over coming in. But beyond that, I actually train other churches on how to ballot collect. And it's not just our church doing it. So we have churches from Northern California all the way down to the border collecting ballots.
Most Christians may not realize that up until 2017, the process of setting up locations where voters can drop off their ballots to then be transported to an official voting center was not yet legal. In fact, mail-in voting didn't go mainstream until California passed a law in 2016, which allowed voters to designate not only relatives, but any individual to return their vote-by-mail ballots if they are unable to do so themselves. So with California leading the way, why did it take most Christian get-out-the-vote efforts until 2020 or later to start using ballot collecting strategies? Political commentator and Christian author Craig Huey.
So, partially an answer to the question as to why in the past the church, when they saw an erosion of our culture and our politics and threats to religious freedom, why didn't they do ballot harvesting? The main reason is ballot harvesting was not legal. Ballot harvesting is only allowed really through either legal or because the laws are such you can get away with it in about 30 states. Other states, it's illegal. It used to be illegal everywhere. The way the elections were back in those days, there was one day for an election. Oftentimes, depending upon your state, Those days, you wouldn't even be able to have a vote by mail ballot if you were sick. That slowly began to change. So if you had a compelling reason to be able to get a vote by mail ballot, but they still required knowing who you were, knowing about your registration, making sure that there wasn't voter fraud going on. Well, what happened starting in California, actually 2016 and 17, ballot harvesting became legal for the first time.
In fact, says Huey, this was all started by what he calls radical left activists who relied on traditional methods like door knocking and cold calling to get them to their polling place.
They did it what I call community ballot harvesting. And community ballot harvesting is taking the old-fashioned way of how do you get people to the poll? Well, you call them, you knock on their door, you offer a babysitter, you offer a car, you do whatever you can to get them to the poll. Ballot harvesting enables you to pick up 1 ballot, 5 ballots, 50 ballots, 500 ballots, and be able to drop them off without any accountability, without any tracing of where these ballots came from. There's reports of people picking up ballots at apartment complexes, at nursing homes. People have been caught with bundles of ballots. So in these states where ballot harvesting is legal, there's a whole methodology of how to be able to use those.
Then, of course, came the coronavirus pandemic of 2020. To say COVID changed everything when it comes to voting would be an understatement. The World Health Organization declared the international COVID outbreak a pandemic on March 11th, 2020. By the end of March, dozens of states had postponed or canceled in-person voting and opted to conduct their elections by mail. These changes also included an unprecedented shift to using ballot drop boxes.
It's democracy Snoop Dogg style.
Drop it like it's hot. Drop it like it's hot.
Just drop it in a box.
Voting by drop boxes taking a star turn in 2020 from Star Trek's George Takei to pop star Camila Cabello.
In January 2020, just 8 states had statutes authorizing the use of ballot drop boxes. But once the pandemic hit, drop boxes were used statewide or in some cities or counties in 40 states and Washington, D.C. for the 2020 general election, according to the Stanford MIT Healthy Elections Project. A similar shift occurred with mailed ballot applications. While 0 states had policies to mail applications for absentee ballots or mail ballots to all registered voters in January 2020, ahead of the November 2020 election, at least a dozen states temporarily changed their policies and mailed ballot applications to all registered voters. In Connecticut, Delaware, Illinois, Iowa, Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, Nebraska, Ohio, Rhode Island, and Wisconsin. In the run-up to the 2020 election, this led to several reports of, quote, unauthorized ballot boxes popping up in California and fueled suspicions of voter fraud, culminating in efforts like True the Vote and 2,000 Mules by Dinesh D'Souza, which alleged widespread and still unproven irregularities in the 2020 election.
We have put together, I think, the most extensive and inclusive voter fraud organization in the history of American politics. Let me say it again.
The 2020 election was the most secure
election in American history.
Let me begin by asking a very simple question. Do we know the truth about what really happened in the 2020 election?
I think millions of Americans know something went wrong, and they have little pieces, and no one's really put it together.
I'm agnostic on this question, and I am awaiting more information. If I believed the president were a Nazi, I might steal an election.
Bold accusations require bold evidence, and they haven't seen it.
In February 2024, a survey from conservative think tank the Heartland Institute, in partnership with Rasmussen Reports, found over a quarter of Americans engaged in ballot fraud during the 2020 presidential election. Former President Trump and some of his supporters have repeatedly claimed election fraud cost him that election. Many of these claims are based almost exclusively on mail-in ballots. In 2020, for example, 58% of Joe Biden voters voted by mail, almost double the rate of Trump voters. As recently as 2012, the New York Times, long considered the unofficial paper of record in the U.S., found mail-in ballots are rejected by officials at a rate of 2%, double the rate of those cast in person. This margin, analysts say, would have likely swayed the electoral vote in several key states in 2020. Despite the controversy surrounding the 2020 vote, Yates says the practice of ballot collection is spreading among churches because it works.
I look at something like ballot collection similarly, that it's a strategy that works in order to ensure that more people are voting and being able to cast their vote, and that it's being collected and secured in a better manner.
There's clearly a strong argument in favor of the effectiveness of ballot collection efforts. But what about those conservative voters, many of whom identify as Christian, who may not be comfortable with the strategy? Yates says staying on the sidelines may no longer be an option.
There is a lot of people who are collecting ballots for the left, and they're doing it in such a way that they are targeting people that they know are voting with them and for them. And in doing so, they're helping to ensure more votes for a candidate and a worldview that they support. And so I think we've got to be smart. I think we've got to do some things that, if we care about the direction of the nation, if we care about the values that the candidates oppose or support, then we have to be smart about the processes that we put into place to get candidates who will support or oppose those issues elected. And ballot gathering, ballot collecting is one way to do that. It's not our traditional way, but it's proven to be effective in the states that allow it. And so I think we should pursue it.
Despite the unprecedented rule changes allowing for mail-in ballots for the 2020 election, since then, lawmakers in 31 states have introduced legislation aimed at limiting third-party ballot returns. More than 24 bills in 11 states have been enacted, including in Florida, where it's now a felony for anyone to collect more than 2 mail ballots other than their own or those of an immediate family member. Still, that hasn't stopped both Democrats and Republicans from advocating for continued ballot collection efforts, albeit with slightly differing language. In 2020, Democrats generally favored the practice, using the term ballot collection, while Republicans generally opposed it, referring to the practice as ballot harvesting. For the 2024 election cycle, however, Republicans may be changing their tune. Newly appointed RNC co-chair Laura Trump.
We have to do things like legal ballot harvesting all across this country. We have to ensure that on election day, we have so many votes banked for Donald Trump that it doesn't matter how many 3 a.m. dumps they have or suitcases full of ballots, Donald Trump will be victorious.
Gleason says it's the right move if Christians want to make sure their voices are being heard.
What it boils down to is numbers. Are the Christians going to come out and vote because they want to influence the policies that are forced upon us, whether it's DC or state or local? But we need voters to turn out, and we need to outnumber those who have opposing views, because it all comes down to the vote. So we ballot collect, we take back our school board, and then we have the majority because we outnumbered. We came out and got the vote out. And we can bring good policies that are going to protect our children. And it's not just about parental rights and protecting our children from sexual indoctrination. It's across the board, any issue that you want to think about, whether it's taxes or water or the state budget, any issue. We should have the right to defend and protect and express what we believe about the laws that govern us. So we need Christians to turn out.
So we know ballot collecting is not only legal, or lawful as the Apostle Paul might put it, but it's also encouraged. But does that mean it's morally or even biblically justifiable? Huey says while earlier generations of Christian voters may see the practice as unseemly or even ungodly, it's one of the keys to making sure the church's voice is heard in D.C. and nationwide.
Church ballot harvesting is something that requires the cooperation of the pastor and the church elders and people within the church to understand that we're in a very historic time in America. We're in a crisis right now. So what we see in America is a variety of different issues. On the ballot in 2024 is the issue of Israel. On the ballot in 2024 is the issue of the persecuted church worldwide. On the ballot right in 2024 is the issue of Christian rights. And when we have the government bureaucracy targeting evangelical Christians, pro-lifers, traditional Catholics, people of faith, we are in a situation where the church can't be silent. They got to stand up and say, enough is enough. And so ballot harvesting is one of the manifestations of how we can change our country. You give me 3 or 4 churches in an assembly district or a large city, and you'll be able to move that election in the direction where it's going to reflect more of a Christian worldview. And so justifiably, the church needs to take high ground and stand strong. The pastors and church leaders need to speak out against what's happening and speak up for what needs to be done. I think there's a problem with the idea that the church should not get involved in politics.
For Samuel Rodriguez, pastor and founder of the National Hispanic Christian Leadership Conference, voter registration and other efforts to promote Christian voting numbers are fair game. But when it comes to ballot collection, that's more of a gray area.
Yeah, no, I do believe in voter registration. I do believe in that churches should register their constituents and say, hey, here's a registration booth in the back, register to vote, and lay out the items. In full disclosure, I don't get on my stage and say, vote for this candidate, because I think that's an insult to the intellect of my congregation. They're not robots. They're not cult followers. They're individuals with free will. I'll give them what I believe it's the biblical base in different subject matters, priorities according to the Word of God. But it's totally up to them, right? But voter registration, yes. Ballot collection, which you and I both know is code word for ballot harvesting, legally, legal ballot harvesting, that's a tough one. Because we were all opposed to ballot harvesting like a few years ago. And now we're flipping it, and because the other side uses ballot harvesting. I get it. I understand it. Use their tactic, right? I don't know if a church should be in the forefront of collecting ballots, because there may be some implications, any accusations, that sort of thing, and may infringe upon the reputation and the integrity and the effectiveness of that church and that corresponding community. But if pastors do engage in collecting ballots, I respect that. I don't condemn them in light of what took place in the 2020 election and 2016.
Rodriguez acknowledges the spiritual reality in which we live, but he says Christians also have a higher calling to which we should aspire.
As Christians, we don't operate like the world. We shouldn't ask ourselves, is it legal? We should ask ourselves, yeah, if it's legal, yes. Is it legal? But is it ethical? And we should always have a higher standard for that or any other issue.
The question then for the 2024 election and beyond is this: will the church support not merely what is legal, but what is the right thing to do? Or will it succumb to increasingly political means to, at least for some, help usher in the kingdom of God?